Welcome to the 44th episode of First Person Podcast. This is part 2 of our 3-part series that we are doing to examine how games are introduced to us and played with on YouTube. For part 2, we are going to be looking at the lore analysis videos that get worked into the mainstream YouTube feed every so often. And yes, this was my way of working in a reason to talk about Dark Souls. But before we begin, who is everybody and what have you been playing recently?
I am Sabrina Scandura. I am the current editor-in-chief and book review/interview section head. Lately, I've been playing some Deep Rock Galactic, which has been fun. And also, I let my boyfriend play Resident Evil 2 while I watched behind closed or covered eyes with my hands, and that was terrifying, but I understand why everybody appreciates that game so much.
I'm Patrick. I am the managing editor and head of essays, and I am still on Persona 5, but I feel like I'm in the home stretch. I'm like, I without giving too much away, I think I'm in the last I'm in December. Let's just say that for anyone who knows Persona. So I'm in the last month where there's actually like full-on gameplay, but I've also been, I guess last summer, the Racial Equality and Justice bundle from itch.io came out, or was released, and I feel like a lot of people got that. And I kind of picked up some videos or some video games before, but now I've actually been going through and like checking out ones that I've wanted to check out. So that's been really fun, just playing a bunch of like shorter kind of, just shorter, kind of more interesting games. One that stands out to me is Magic Trick, which is like a low stakes, like super positive, like Tony Hawk level, where you're like a little wizard that you have to like make friends and just kind of like skateboard around. And then like at the end of the video, whenever you're done, you go home and there's like a party that's held. It's fantastic. But yeah, that's me.
I'm Alex. I'm the section head for commentaries. Lately, I have hit pause on playing Dark Souls to marathon my way through the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Is that game fun? Yes. Is it good? I'm still playing it. Is it better than the original? I'm still playing it. It sure is a game, and there sure is a lot of it.
The good stuff of that game was so good, and the not so good and bad stuff, I really felt the not so good and bad of it.
Honestly, like, I don't know if it's safe for me to get into this because I have a lot of thoughts about that game. I played the original FF7 like almost exactly a year ago, and absolutely fell in love with it and understood why people care about it so much. And boy, does that sure inform my many opinions about the remake.
My name is Giuseppe Femia. I'm your podcast host and producer, and I've been playing AFK Arena. I've switched over to mobile games in the light of the pandemic, not allowing me to actually go out and buy any more physical copies of legitimate things that I want to play. But for AFK Arena, I would just describe it as a much better version of Raid Shadow Legend, which has been blowing up over the past year and a half, I guess. But with that, we can transfer over to our first question. We're talking about the analysis videos, and this would be stuff like MatPat or VatiVidya, who go in and look at all the either code or lore or just deep information regarding video games or just background information that that people might not get in every single playthrough. So these kind of videos, what do they bring? What do they contribute to the gaming community?
I kind of feel like my favorite part of these games is how they give games like a really long afterlife. You know, kind of like my favorite, any kind of criticism, like movie criticism, any media, is something that comes like a bit after, where you kind of like really dig deep and give it a good analysis. And this really like lets games live longer, especially like you mentioned MatPat. And like, you know, where would Pokemon or, you know, Lavender Town or Five Nights at Freddy's be without channels like that you just really dig deep into like the minutia of the stories?
Well, I think for Five Nights at Freddy's, yes, but also it's because of those kind of videos that Five Nights at Freddy's has such an extensive like background, and even the guy who makes Five Nights at Freddy's, in response to some of MatPat's videos, he actually goes in and changes some stuff, which has created a whole new narrative for how the analysis videos actually affect the video of the games that they're analyzing.
Wow, that creates like such a strange precedent of like like fan videos then informing the actual final product, which is crazy.
I don't know if that's actually that sort of like that's definitely a thing that happens, and I think it happens a lot more than it would appear to. Like I think for a lot of us, or for me anyway, and for Joey certainly, like one of the big sort of like unpacker sources of unpacker videos in our lives are about things like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and things like that. And I really think that there's a degree to which those games are made to sort of pander to. I don't know if pandering is too charged a word, but they're made to encourage that kind of engagement, right? There's an obscurity to a lot of those games and their stories, and they're sort of there for you to try to dig into. Uh, Again, my main point of contact here is Bloodborne, where it's a game that's extremely good at sort of leaving out crumbs, like for people to chase down and try to make sense of. Like, the first thing you're told in that game is to seek pale blood, which is a term that never gets a clear definition in the story, which has been debated extensively by fans and sort of fan analysts, and which the creators of the games themselves have actually provided like differing like and semi-contradictory explanations for. So I think there's an extent to which this is sort of game producers are increasingly going in expecting that these things are going to happen, and sort of trying to encourage that kind of engagement with the product.
Yeah, and these videos kind of like show the face of a lot of the arguments about lore and concepts that come up from the actual background Reddit communities and pages of people debating that nobody else has the time to read. But it makes it so that things like people's enjoyment of a game doesn't boil down to, oh, I like these mechanics. Oh, I thought this was cool. It's more like, oh, I think that Priscilla is Havel's daughter because the Thorlund connection that he and his wife have are this, but it's never explicitly said in game, and it's only through these like back channels of information that anything actually like goes into some kind of analysis that can be, it kind of creates a new discourse around the entire thing.
Definitely encourages deep reading, which I really like. Just like taking every little breadcrumb as Bloodborne lays out, and just saying like, what could this mean, and just like analyzing and looking at it over and over again. I guess it's what academics do essentially.
I'm also thinking about how this is. I sort of looked into fan studies a bit when I was writing my comps, and there was this one piece that I came across, and I wish I could remember anything about like the title or author or where it was published. It was basically, the argument was they were looking, and this is sort of stepping away from YouTube for a second, but they were looking at the Westworld fandom, and they were looking at the relationship between the producers of Westworld and its fan community on, I believe, Reddit. And the argument in this paper was that the creators of Westworld were very in the way that they were handling online communities, in the way that they were also going about creating and interacting with fan websites and fan spaces generally. For instance, they're like shutting down, making IP claims against certain fan sites, while then sort of appropriating and aspects of their aesthetic or aspects of how they were operating. The argument was that Westworld was actively sort of using these forms of secondary interpretation to create sort of insider and outsider fans, which I think is a sort of interesting element to this, and to these sort of what we talk about is these sort of bilateral relationships between the fans and the creators of the fanish object. The argument there was basically that they were creating sort of insider fans, or fans who were performing their interpretation of the game in a sort of sanctioned way. And so this was sort of fit into Westworld's larger MO of making the exact nature of the story kind of ambiguous, and leaving certain details as big question marks at the heart of the thing. And their argument was that this also helps them sort of manage the kinds of fanish activity that get done, that in creating these sort of sources of rich ambiguities, you and encouraging these kind of interpretive works, what you get is it moves energies away from things that contradict the narrative, by making the narrative itself and understanding the narrative the site of what fans do. It sort of shifts attention away from efforts to reappropriate the narrative or recreate it on people's own terms, which has bearings on things like sort of queer readings and the kind of things you see in fan fiction and things like that. That these sort of analysis videos, one of the things they do to problematize them a little is they ultimately sort of reify the developer of the game or the creator of the product generally, as the sort of final authority or the proper authority on what the correct interpretation is. And they sort of, they also reify that notion of a correct reading, which is maybe sort of orthogonal to what we're talking about here, but I think is a sort of interesting thing to have in tension with the idea that these sort of fanish loving products. Is they also fit into a way of engaging with these games that is very much plays to their interests as consumer goods, which is, someone who does sort of a Marxian analysis in his own research is something I harp on a lot.
Yeah, I think of YouTube channels like Zeltic specifically when it comes to that whole the developers being the authority and proper interpretation. We are all very well aware of how the Zelda franchise doesn't have a very, what's the word I want? Essentially, there's a lot of plot holes. So when fans were originally trying to figure out what the timeline was, then the developers, like Nintendo, they published the Hyrule Historia, and that timeline became like the timeline. But then you have like YouTube videos like channels like Zeltic and several others that help fill in the gaps or bigger gaps that were created by that established authority timeline by offering various fan theories. So it gives the gaming community, the Zelda gaming community, a little bit of closure because it gives them something to think about with using these analyses, like to help fill in those gaps. And I think that's incredibly important, specifically for something that doesn't actually have like an online sort of venue. Like, so the Zelda series doesn't really have an online play where you play with other people, at least not that I can think of, and not in the main games. So it's something that it's somewhere else for the gaming community to collectively come together and try to piece together this overarching narrative and figure out, well, what does this symbol mean and what does that monster mean if it appears in this game for some random reason, rather than just going straight to the developers could have been just reusing assets. This is a lot more enticing and fun.
Yeah, it's like that idea of like you find that a lot in like talking about Stanley Kubrick, where like every little thing is purposely put in like a specific place. And I really like that they're like kind of what you were talking about with Zelda is like they're kind of like putting the developer or the auteur of the piece on this pedestal, but then also like taking the power away from the auteur, the developer, in like determining what that meaning is. Because like, you would think that the Zelda, the Zelda encyclopedia, but there's so many holes that fans are like, no, this is not definitive. There's more to this. So I like that they're kind of like these videos and like this fan energy is kind of like giving too much credit to the developers at the same time as taking away their power in determining the meaning of the story.
I think the Zelda example is especially rich when you consider around 2016 we were having all these sort of, when they released those first trailers for Breath of the Wild and Link was looking a little bit femme, there were these big questions of like, oh my god, is this finally the game where Link can be a girl? And Nintendo had the tact and good I don't know, I'll just leave it at tact to just go up on a stage and be like, nah, Link can't be a girl because of these lore reasons that we made up, which was, rightly, I think, received pretty poorly because it's just such lore is this thing. I think that one of the things with lore is that it's serious, but it's also like very clearly this constructed thing, right? Like you can't. Nintendo of all people cannot treat Zelda lore like it's the Bible because they're the ones who make it up, and they're the ones who sort of people have endowed with this authority to make it up. And so I think it reads as pretty ridiculous when Nintendo is like, well, if you look at this thing in the Hyrule Historia or whatever sort of flimsy grounds they made this argument upon, they're like, well, it's actually impossible for Link to ever be a girl, and people were pretty annoyed about that. And it also makes me think of these efforts we've seen from Nintendo to sort of put more of a spotlight on the women in the Zelda franchise in the ensuing games. Like, I mean, there was Linkle, which came out before. Linkle is a hilarious little. I don't know what they were thinking with that one. But then, in Breath of the Wild, it was the first game where, Zelda is framed as having, any real kind of agency. And then we had the Hyrule Warrior games where she was playable. And then, they've also, in what little we've seen of Breath of the Wild 2, sort of indicated that she's going to have an important role to play in there. But all of this, for me, again, feels like a way of kind of managing this fan demand for a reading of Link that is sort of maybe a little troubling to Nintendo's otherwise rather conservative politics, right? For every step forward they take, Nintendo remains like a pretty conservative company. And so I can't help but sort of scoff at things like, I mean, not that it's bad, but it is sort of funny to see them now hurrying to, realizing that fans are mad that there are no women in the spotlight in Zelda, and going, well, okay, sorry, Link can't be a girl, but here's more of Zelda. And again, for me, that feels like a way of sort of wrangling these fans who would make Link into a girl if they had the ability to do so, and a way of kind of controlling is a strong word, but again, managing the sort of spectrum of acceptable readings.
Would you say then that these YouTube videos could be a site where queer spaces could be created outside of like what is the norm and what is the lore and what is set in stone for certain video games?
I think they could be, but I wonder, like, I have a particular sort of reticence about lore videos in that I think they really foreground the idea that there's a correct reading, which I think runs really counter to a lot of some of the, the principal tenets of queer theory, which is that, queer theory is all about sort of bringing to the fore. I mean, Joey, I think you're working more closely with this stuff than I am. It's been a few years for me, but my understanding of it is, queer theory is about centering the act of reading as the sort of act of construction of truth. And so the queer reading is always sort of a form of extracting meaning from the text that nonetheless implicates the reader and the reader's, own sort of desires and interests. And I think that lore videos speak to a sort of contestation of that validity, and this sort of speak to an idea that there is, a truth internal to these texts that can be arrived at. So yeah, I think I trailed off mid-sentence there, but I think that's my answer to your question. Is I'm actually a little. I have not. Maybe I haven't been looking at the right lore videos, but the ones I've seen are very focused on the text as a source of truth, that like as a source of immutable truth, which is, I think, inimical to the idea of queer reading unless you happen to be working with a very queer text.
Then with that note, we can go on to our next question. So how have these analysis videos affected how games are approached and considered by the players? So instead of looking at the gaming community and the companies, we can take a look at the other end of the spectrum where it is the people who are engaging with these analysis videos and then later with the games themselves.
I think this kind of moves smoothly from what Alex was saying about how like lore videos are prioritizing the actual text as like the end all be all. But in a way, also, I feel like if we get a bit out of lore videos and just to analysis videos in general, one thing I find that's really lacking, or rather what gets analyzed, are really like the most prestigious games that then become like sort of the kind of games worthy of analysis, if that makes sense, like Zelda series, Five Nights at Freddy's. Whereas Undertale is maybe like the most indiest game that gets really like tackled, but there's really like there's no I haven't been able to find good analysis on kind of smaller games that aren't like the big series like Metal Gear or Half-Life or that kind of thing. Like the closest I've found is actually Ragnaroks, who does this series called Games from the Underground. And although he doesn't talk too much about lore, he's really like kind of he groups these sort of smaller indie games, like 4 per video, and really analyzes them. But still, he's kind of putting the title of underground on them, so he's othering them from like sort of typical analysis. But yeah, what do you guys think about that? Do you feel like analysis videos are kind of creating their own canon of what can be analyzed or what deserves to be analyzed?
Oh, absolutely. Particularly what deserves to be analyzed, because not to beat a dead horse, but if I keep going back to the Legend of Zelda, like as much as a lot of fans were sort of disappointed at the quote unquote non-canonical, like the lack of conclusion of the non-canonical female Link, a lot of the lore videos on YouTube don't focus on things that are not deemed to be possible within like the canon of Zelda. So everything will focus on highly specific details in games that are, even if they're not easily tied to the canon, are a lot more plausible than, well, could the hero have been female, yes or no, or something like that. And I'm just using that as one of several examples of something like that. Like even when it comes to who people ship Link with, like there's a lot of fan theories about who he ends up with in this game or that game. But at the same time, there's sort of like a difference between serious like analysis videos, and they don't focus on that stuff because it's not like part of the canon or possibly part of the canon type of idea.
It also makes me think that we were talking about kind of like algorithms and what gets brought up in algorithms on YouTube. I feel like that's also a problem too. Like YouTube is going to prefer games that are more popular and kind of topics about games that are more popular. So those are going to become the like dominant ones that people are become more aware of in a sort of like algorithmic feedback loop.
I mean, I get very excited about algorithms and platform governance. So that's something that really, really resonates with me, Patrick. And I think that it also sort of speaks to your earlier question about like, what games is it that are going to get covered in these videos? And I think that you're right that there's sort of the algorithm plays an important role there. I mean, it depends, but if you're trying to make it big on YouTube and if you're making the kind of video that is sort of going, if you're putting in the time and effort to make like one of these really detailed videos, chances are you're aiming at getting a decent number of viewers, right? You're not it's not that it never happens, but people rarely do this on its own, like just for funsies, at least at that level of investment, right? Making a YouTube video is an extremely laborious process. And so I think people tend to be drawn to games that are, trending or that are going to be, that have a chance, a chance of helping them get monetized. It's the same sort of thing you see on Twitch, right? Like a lot of these times, it's not even that they're trying to, make an easy buck or that they're trying to like get rich, but that they're trying to, at least pay for the next game they want to make a video of. At the same time, I do feel like there is maybe a little more flex room in the analytic in the sort of analysis video as opposed to the lore video. I don't know. This is just a hunch. I can't think of any videos that confirm this, but I do know that I'm more drawn personally to analysis videos, and I think that while the range of text they're working with might be fairly constrained, I find the range of ideas expressed to be a lot more a lot more varied, because it's not that one. I think that format specifically highlights the agency of the person making the video in constructing their idea on it, right? like if you're doing an analysis video of like The Last of Us or whatever, you're not, I've dug into The Last of Us to find the truth of it. You're like, I played The Last of Us, and these are the things I'm thinking about as, that I want to share, which is, I think, where we, see a return to somewhere with a little more room for people to express readings that might be what you might call unruly or divergent, and for people to sort of respond maybe more harshly or critically to things, to aspects of the text that might not sit well with them.
I mean, technically, what we've been doing for the podcast and when we're looking at specific games can be considered analysis videos now that they're up on YouTube. But for what we actually do in them, we're analyzing the themes and looking at it in an academic context, and that would also constitute the kind of analysis that you're looking for. And yes, as opposed to lore, there is a lot more wiggle room to show our own personality with each concept that we bring up and talk about.
I also like that as you're talking, like there is a like there's genre constraints to the analysis video in that it's typically an older game, and you're not giving just like a plain review. You're actually kind of like getting deep on some aspects of it, and maybe you're not even talking about how good or bad it is. You're just talking about what elements are good and what elements are bad. And yeah, it is a lot more compelling and a lot more creative than something like a review video, and I guess opens it up for more, I guess, more smaller games or more different kind of games, or being like, look at this, look at that interesting thing. But personally, I find that these smaller or more interesting games aren't looked at on YouTube, or at least they're not being suggested to me, or I can't find them when I search them on YouTube or that sort of thing.
Well, and ironically, I find that where those, I'm thinking about, I mentioned last month, I think, Errant Signal, which is sort of one of the channels that I use to learn about sort of deep cut games. But Errant Signal, yeah, there's like two varieties of video, and one of them is sort of, or Matthew Matosis does this kind of thing too, I think. But they've got two varieties of video, and one of them is like, all right, here's like a deep dive, like critical analysis of a sort of famous game you may have heard of, or here is a short review / expose on a game you might not have heard about. And those are two very different formats, and I almost never see them overlap. So I almost never see the sort of deep critical analysis of a game you might have never heard of. Those ones tend to be just like, hey, here's this cool thing I found, and I think you should know about it. And I wonder if that part of that doesn't come from the way the developers of smaller games are positioned. I think that at least part of it, and this is speaking from my sort of experiences in like RPG publishing spaces, which is largely micro publishing. People are more inclined to sort of boost visibility for a lot of these small press RPG products, because they don't want to, hurt the creator's prospects, right? They don't want to publish something that might make the creator look bad because they see them as like, an underdog or someone who stands to lose a lot more from a critical response to, from like a sort of sustained critical response to their work, whereas they stand to benefit a lot more from just like, hey, this thing exists and here's why it's good.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, it's kind of almost like you're like, well, I don't want to take down this small creator in any kind of way. I want their stuff to be shared. When like analysis could, if not bring out, like, no game's perfect, so like analysis could bring out some really interesting stuff about it. But yeah, I totally get that. And like, were I to, like, when I was reviewing stuff for Rue Morgue magazine, it was all like super low budget, like shoestring, zero budget. And I would definitely not want to be too hard on these movies. I would definitely want to be more promotional, because like, yeah, you don't want to take down the little guys.
All right, and then with that, we can move on to our last question of the day. So how have these kind of videos affected the intended play of game developers on the development end of things?
There are a lot more games that hide lore in item descriptions now.
Yes, and one of my favorite parts about Dark Souls is there is a medallion that in the description of it says it does nothing, and everyone was like, no, it can't do nothing, and then they like chose it and wore it and banged on every single wall to find some hidden passage that it might unlock, just to realize that it does nothing. And everyone in the community had like this moment of like engagement with it that with something so simple was just too fulfilling to attempt.
I mean, actually, to that point, I think they've also. This is maybe an interesting thing. It has encouraged video game developers to sort of to go. I mean, in some ways, we used to see this a lot back in the early days of video gaming when there were fewer rules and more strategy guides. But like to hide things in the game and to with the knowledge that players are going to help each other find them and that it's not all on one player to uncover the fullness of the game. And again, FromSoft does this stuff really beautifully, I find. This is not a YouTube video, but one of my favorite pieces of sort of like gaming ephemera is the Bloodborne wiki page on Orphan of Kos, who is like an insanely hard boss in that game. Because, each of these wiki pages always have a sort of strategy section where it's like, okay, here's a handful of strategies that can get you through this boss. But for Orphan of Kos, it's like 100 people all just going like, I don't know, this is what worked for me, but this guy's super hard. And like, there is no, like often in wikis, you have like over the evolution of a wiki or like a fan discourse, you'll have consensus emerge. But with Orphan of Kos, it's purely anecdotal because no one really knows a good way to beat.
I like that we sort of now have, because of these YouTube videos, like a culture of nitpickers who like, if you put something out there, it's going to get torn apart, especially if you're like a AAA developer. And I like that developers have to deal with that because it makes it a lot more interesting with games. And yeah, so like Dark Souls purposely making things obfuscated or or Zelda creators having to come out and be like, actually Link's a boy, where it's like, okay, well, I don't know, there's like a more of like creators, and especially big creators, have to think more when they put out a product because they know it's going to be torn apart. And I think that's maybe ultimately a good thing.
Can I play devil's advocate on that point?
No. Just
okay.
Kidding. Yes, please go.
So this is coming from like my pretentious art school days, basically. But that's actually one of the we're talking about that pressure on designers. I'm actually not sure that's something that's intrinsically good for developers. And what I mean by that is I think the sort of normalization of that expectation that, the fullness of a game can eventually be uncovered and translated into, a set of videos and or wiki articles also presumes that the story is built in such a way that is given to that reading. And you can see people getting really nasty about, story details that they'll determine haven't been properly thought through, or things that they'll call plot holes, when really I don't think that's the only way to sort of shape a story. And I think that, as a consequence of the way they get dissected, games are expected to ultimately not have a whole lot of ambiguity in them once you get at them. Like I'm thinking again about this intense debate over the meaning of the term pale blood in Bloodborne. It's possible if you look at the way stories get made, you hear all the time about people just throwing in these things and they're like, well, I don't know what that means. That's not within the scope of the story. And I wonder if it's, healthy for games as a whole for that sort of level of resolution to be expected of the author, of the developer as a sort of story author.
I you know what, the way you put it, I agree with you. I was kind of thinking like just this kind of ball of cultural energy is just kind of creating this like creative production and everything from both ends, from fans and from creators, and that can only be good things. But yeah, you're right. It does create kind of a lot of, distaste. And, when I think about how venomous fans get when like, adaptations or sequels don't take into account, or the idea that like Mass Effect 3 changed the ending as like a free DLC because fans got so mad at them. Yeah, it can be bad.
Or like, we're going back to Final Fantasy VII Remake for a second. There was like backlash over the way they designed Aerith's face. Like, although that's maybe whack. A separate issue, but Final Fantasy VII is a game that's been, scrutinized to death. And I think that part of a lot of the flaws or the things that really don't work for me in the remake are things that were done to accommodate the fact that extant body of knowledge and that process of dissecting weighs so heavily on the identity of the game now.
What are your take on this, Sabrina or Joey?
I don't know that I have much to add exactly. I think there is something to be said. I'm a little more cynical when I think about the way it has impacted developers. It absolutely has impacted the choices developers make, especially when I think of the Final Fantasy example, or even going beyond video games, I think of the Sonic example. But at the same time, at the end of the day, I don't think it impacts... I don't think communities like this that exist on YouTube through these analysis videos impact developers' decisions enough, and they should, in my opinion, because you have a lot of AAA companies that have big investors that don't care about a good quality game, and instead they just care about the game being like mediocre enough to make enough money, and enough people will still buy it. So then you have like a lot of disappointment through AAA games. Like, I'm still going to sit here and say that I'm so disappointed, Ubisoft, at Valhalla. The PC port was dreadful, but that's my soapbox. But what I'm getting at is I think that it's a slow sort of motion towards like a potential to impact things to a significant degree, because it does impact things at least slightly. But I think there needs to be more of a push. I don't know how we can mobilize it through this kind of community, because like beyond what we already have through these like analysis videos that establish a community, especially for games that don't have the online portion. But I want to see it go further. I want to see things get taken a lot further, is where my head's at.
Take us home, Joey. What do you think?
I think that you guys have pretty much covered it. Anyways, I think that we've hit a dead end with what we can talk about for this part of YouTube. So if we want to all introduce ourselves one last time.
Yeah, I am Sabrina. I'm the editor-in-chief and also the book reviews/interviews section head. You can find me on Twitter at SabrinaAliciaSG. Yes, I actually remembered my Twitter handle and got it right this time. You can also find me on Twitch, www.twitch.tv/BrainiacBree, or go to the First Person Scholar Twitch, which is just /First Person Scholar. I will be streaming Friday, and we're also going to be streaming on Mondays with Patrick, and I'm going to let Patrick talk about that one.
Hi, I'm Patrick. I'm on Twitter at PatRDolan. And actually, kind of related to what I was playing earlier, I'm trying to, put little micro reviews of games in the like racial justice and equality bundle on itch.io as I go through them. So if you want some cool picks from that, if you bought it in the summer and you just have a bunch of games, great, I don't know. Check out my Twitter. And yes, I am. Along with the First Person Scholar on Twitch, I am at twitch.tv /Dr. Sand Monster, and I stream on Wednesdays, I stream on Mondays, and I typically do like pixely, low poly games and talk about how they feel to play and why they're pixely or low poly.
I'm Alex. You can find me on Twitter at Alex_I_chalk. It is like 98% shit posts. I'm also going to be sort of hosting FPS's forthcoming, will be out by the time this podcast is online, RPG actual play thing where we're going to experiment with playing some proto D&D archaic role-playing games and basically make it up as we go on. So if you're listening to this, that's already available in some form, and you should go watch and or listen to it. And yes,
My name is Giuseppe Femia. I'm your podcast host and producer, and you can find me at _foolsbait on Twitter and nowhere else. But if you're interested in webcomics, my webcomic that I've been writing for has just released like last week, Monday, so go check that out. It's called The Legends of Kayamor, or www.kayamor.com.
Yay, congrats, Joey.
Oh yeah, I actually read that first chapter, and I thought it was really fun. And it reminded me a bit of Tower of God, which is a manga I like. And I like jester characters, and you had one of those.
Thanks for listening to the First Person Podcast. What is your favorite gaming channel? Let us know on Twitter at FPS Weekly, or start a conversation using the hashtag First Person Podcast. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femia with support from the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.